Hello, this is Crisis Counseling in Ministry. This is Lecture 2 in our course entitled, What is a Crisis? Today in this lecture we're going to try to accomplish several learning goals. The first is to try to actually come up with a definition for a crisis. What is a crisis? Secondly, we'll determine and reach a definition for a crisis as we will use it in our class. Thirdly, we'll describe the difference between a crisis, an emergency, and a problem. Because as we will see, those are three different things. Although they're often thought of as the same, they really are not. So let's begin with a definition of a crisis. The word crisis, or crises, the plural, is used in a lot of different ways today. It can be used to describe a phase in human development. We hear about an identity crisis in a teenager, or oftentimes a midlife crisis in a man in his 40s or 50s. We hear the word crisis a lot from our politicians. We've talked about and gone through what we've described recently as an economic crisis, with the crash of some financial institutions and an apparent recession. We hear a lot about oil crises. We've heard about political crises. We're in the midst of getting ready for another presidential election process, and people are saying we have a political crisis right now. So the word is used a lot of times in that way. Crisis is also used sometimes to describe simple everyday events, such as she lost her car keys and that was a real crisis, or she ran out of gas, he ran out of gas, and that was a real crisis. Sometimes it's used to describe a turning point in human functioning. We talk about someone coming to a crisis in their marriage and changing their ways, changing their patterns of behavior in their marriage. So the problem with the word crisis is that it's used a lot of different ways depending upon the context. So we have to establish our meaning for our purposes so that we can understand what we're talking about. What images come to your mind when you hear the word crisis? Maybe you think of the word urgent. There's something urgent in a crisis. Maybe you think about people who are upset because they're facing a crisis. Perhaps the image that comes to your mind is the feeling of helpless. People who are in crisis will often say that they feel helpless in their situation. Maybe the word that comes to mind is non-functional. Someone who's in grief, who's lost someone dear to them, has a very difficult time doing even the most simple of tasks. Just cooking, driving the car, adding a checkbook can become very difficult. Perhaps the word hopeless comes to mind when you think of a crisis. People can't imagine how they can get out of their situation. There seems to be no solution. Perhaps when you think of a crisis, you think of people who are very anxious. They're nervous. They may even demonstrate physical symptoms of twitching, of sweating, of being in anxiety constantly. Or maybe when you think of crisis, you think of people who are numb. They seem to be psychologically anesthetized so that they don't seem to feel anything. And that really is a part of grief, which we'll talk about later. On the other extreme, you may see people who are in crisis who are hysterical, who cry, who demonstrate great emotion, who seem unable to cope with anything. Every little situation in life seems to be a huge emotional and psychological drain on them. Maybe you think of the word dangerous. Sometimes when people are in crisis, they are in danger. They may be a danger to themselves or to other people. And consequently, we often identify crisis with being out of control. All of those are images that we probably have in our minds for what it means to be in crisis. Let's look at some definitions that have been given to us by crisis intervention specialists. The word crisis in Chinese is really made up of two characters, one that stands for danger and the other that stands for opportunity. So in reality, according to the Chinese understanding of a crisis is in fact a dangerous opportunity. A crisis sometimes is a turning point, a situation in which a decision is required. Will you take the job or not? Will you go to AA or not? Will you marry or not? A crisis involves a person's internal reaction to an external hazard. We'll talk about that a bit in a moment, but that's a part of a crisis. Some people would say a crisis is a state of feeling overwhelmed due to an event or situation for which one is able to cope using one's customary means. Now you'll notice that I put an asterisk at that because that's getting closer to what we're going to use as our definition of a crisis. But these are all definitions that are out there: an opportunity, a turning point, an internal reaction, a sense of being overwhelmed. Let's look at what some crisis intervention specialists will say a crisis is. H. Norman Wright. If you're not familiar with Norman Wright's work, you need to be. If you are going to be a Christian worker, if you're going to be involved in helping people, in working with people, and consequently you're going to deal with people in crisis, you're going to do some forms of counseling, you need to be familiar with Norman Wright. Norman Wright is probably one of the premier evangelical conservative Christian counselors today. Anything that Norman Wright writes, you ought to read, get a hold of, absorb, and put to work. He takes an interesting perspective on what a crisis is when he describes it as a problematic situation. In his book on The New Guide to Crisis and Trauma, he writes, a crisis usually involves a temporary loss of coping ability, and the assumption is that emotional dysfunction is reversible. If the person effectively copes with a threat, he then returns to prior levels of functioning. Now notice there are two or three things in Wright's definition of a crisis. First, he says it is a temporary loss of the ability to cope with the situation. Something has happened that I cannot deal with the resources that I have in front of me, emotionally, financially, personally, relationally, spiritually right now. But the assumption is that I can cope with it, and that if the situation is reversed, I'll be okay. I'll be able to correct the emotional dysfunction at some point. The assumption is that when the person can effectively cope with the situation or the threat, he then will return to normal. So Wright's definition is that at the problematic state, that can be corrected. Everly and Mitchell are guys that you'll read about mostly in crisis, critical incident stress management, which is used especially in police departments, in fire departments, and is used to a large degree by social workers. And in their work on critical incident stress management, they write that a crisis is a state of acute distress wherein one's usual coping mechanisms have failed in the face of a perceived challenge or threat, and there results some degree of functional impairment. Much like Wright, you'll notice that there are two or three factors here. This is acute distress, which overwhelms one's usual coping mechanism. The things you usually do don't work in a crisis. And the result is some degree of functional impairment. That because your normal coping mechanisms aren't working, you are impaired in your function. In the Practitioner's Handbook for Crisis Intervention, the definition is an upset in a steady state, a critical turning point leading to better or worse, a disruption or breakdown in a person's or family's normal or usual pattern of functioning. The upset or disequilibrium is usually acute in the sense that it is of recent origin. Their definition focuses on the fact that you've been in a normal state of equilibrium, and whatever has happened has created this state of disequilibrium and overwhelms the family or individual's ability to deal with it.